All right, finally ready to get going here. I have 59 slides in less than 50 minutes, so I'm going to talk a little bit fast. My name is Joe Brockmeier. Some of you may know me. I currently work for LWN.net. I am not speaking for LWN.net. I want to make that very clear. So this is why I'm not wearing an LWN shirt, so nobody mistakes my opinions for those of the publication. Today what I'm going to be talking about is the Gilded Age of open source and why it's over. And so some content warnings, since everybody loves content warnings these days. There are going to be a couple of things in here that I figure I should warn the audience about ahead of time. First is politics. Reading the LWN comments, there's always somebody who's like, I don't like politics in open source. And my first thought is you have entirely missed the point of open source. And the second thing is, it is whether you like politics or not, it's coming for you. So like, it doesn't matter if you like it, so you all get it. This could be, I know I'm in Europe. I am from the US. I'm sorry. This is going to be a little bit, when I talk about the historical bits, it's going to be a little bit US-centric when I talk about the US Gilded Age, because that's my knowledge and interest. Things happened in Europe at the same time too, but I'm not going to cover many of them. No AI was used in this presentation. I know there are AI boosters here, and I may offend you a little bit, and I'm not sorry. So just so you know, I'm using some loose analogies in this talk, okay? So I know we're all nerds here, right? And we like to poke holes in things and get into the logic of them. I'm just trying to draw some pictures here. I'm not trying, think of this talk almost as like a game of Pictionary. I'm trying to get some ideas into people's heads. I'm not going to say that everything that I draw an analogy from is literal. And also there may be cat pictures. All right, so what we're going to cover, I'm going to talk very quickly about what the Gilded Age was in the United States. Some of you may be history buffs, some of you may not. I'll go through a little bit of that. I'm going to talk about open source's Gilded Age. I'm going to draw some comparisons there. And I am not a historian, nor do I play one on TV, but this is sort of my attempt to nail down a period that could probably be revised. And I'm also going to talk about the end of the Gilded Age for Foss and maybe what might come next. So this is a quote often attributed to Mark Twain that I really like. It's, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme, meaning that things come in cycles and things happen very similarly, but it's not exactly the same anytime. But if you look at history, and I do enjoy, I'm an amateur historian, kind of, I really enjoy. As I get older, I enjoy reading history more. Also, I notice I have more history to look back on that I remember. When I was a kid, I got a C in history, and my dad complained. He said, I never got a C in history. I said, yeah, but there was so much less of it when you were my age. But anyway, we don't really know that Mark Twain said this. There is no documentation to prove that he actually said it, but he said a lot of things, so let's go ahead and give him the credit. But he definitely co-wrote a book called The Gilded Age that historians then applied that label to a historical period. Now, the Gilded Age book was about gilded means that something is maybe like lightly covered in gold. It's not gold all the way through. It's basically a veneer. It's a fake, kind of. And the novel touched on basically how, from his point of view, things looked great from certain angles in the United States, but from others, they looked pretty bad. And I would like to say that this talk sprang into mind because of my deep literary and historical knowledge. But it didn't. It came from a TV show. So there's a show on HBO some of you may be familiar with called The Gilded Age, and it talks about the historical covers that period. And I watched this with my wife. And there's some of the people in the show are real, some of the events historically are real, and then some of it's fictionalized. And there's a fictional robber baron who's portrayed kind of sympathetically. And he's having a conversation with other robber barons about strike breaking, labor breaking, and they're talking about how to do that. And I'm like, that's starting to sound really uncomfortably familiar. And then they have, other parts and episodes that are about stock market crashes and things like that. I'm like, boy, I've seen those before. So it started making me think how, before I was even asked to submit a talk, started to make me think how the last 20 years plus has been kind of a gilded age of open source. So the Gilded Age in the United States, period between the late 70s and 90s, 1870s and 90s, I doubly have to explain that now since I lived through the 70s and 90s this last century. And it's a period between Reconstruction, in other words, the end of the Civil War, and then the progressive era in the United States. It was a time of rapid expansion, especially the railroads, and there are a lot of parallels, to me at least, between the railroad expansion in the United States and the expansion of the internet later on. In 1860, there were about 30,000 miles of railroads. By 1890, approximately 130,000 miles. That's a lot of track to lay in the 1800s, There was a lot of expansion, and it reshaped industry and society, much like the internet did. And it was also an internet bubble before there was an internet bubble. There was a time, a lot of stuff with unions and immigration came up a lot because people were trying to import a lot of labor into the United States to get more bodies to throw at the railroads and mining and in industry, but also people resented the people who were coming into the country at the same time and did not treat them well. And there was also a big divide that this may sound familiar to most of y'all sitting in the room between the skilled and unskilled labor. And for the wage growth, it jumped 59% in 10 years. Don't let that get you too excited because we're really talking about a jump less than $200 a year, or about $200 a year. The equivalent of about $19.8 thousand a year today, or actually 2024. And that was an average. It factored in child labor and other things, but if you were unskilled labor, you got paid a lot less than that. So there was a lot of economic growth during this period. Industrialization took off, wage growth, inequality, a big concentration of wealth. Sound familiar? Except then it was about 4,000 families who had as much wealth as about 11 million people at the time. Not as bad as it is today. And it was an age of robber barons. It was an age of people like John Warren Gates and Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Some of those names might sound familiar, some don't these days, Rockefeller. So there were two major stock market crashes during this period. Pardon me, I'm going to get something to drink here. Just talk amongst yourselves for a minute. So there were two major crashes. The first one, 1873, had to do with silver coinage, and Germany stopped minting coins in silver or using silver as much, which depressed the mining profits and so on. And also they built out all this railroad, and then they realized, but there's not actually a return on this yet. Again, sound familiar, the industry building out things that don't have a return yet? So a lot of railroads failed. There was a great deal of unemployment. But that was nothing compared to the stock market crash of 1893 that led to 20% unemployment. Another railroad bubble, 300 banks closed, 15,000, or yeah, 150, sorry, 15,000. I could barely read with these glasses. In a twist of fate, however, the government did not bail out the banks. J.P. Morgan bailed out the government by lending it gold. I thought this was just a kind of fun, interesting fact, is that they had someone who had so much gold that the government went to him and said, can we pretty please borrow this because we still base our money on gold? He's like, yeah, okay, I'll loan you gold. And this is just a picture of either a soup line or an unemployment line of people looking for work in that era. Can you imagine 20% unemployment? When you talk about AI, think about 20% unemployment. So the Gilded Age ended, and that led to the progressive era in the 1890s, which led to antitrust laws, which led to regulation of food and what's in food, or what you don't want in food, more likely. Muckraking, which I'm particularly fond of, muckraking being the investigative journalism and going after the powerful and telling truth to power. Attacking government corruption, because one of the things about the robber barons was they basically controlled everything. They had their fingers in everything and they could move governments. And there was also more leisure. People had more opportunities because of the 8-hour workday and so on, actually had more time on their hands. All right, we need a break from that, right? So I promised a cat picture. This is also going to be a little visual demonstration. These are 2 of our cats. We have 4. We used to have 7. This is Sir Wobbles and his sister Cupcake. This is when we first got them. That was then. This is now. And in the background, you can see the dog trying to get into the cat bed. He's trying to get into the cat bed because they won't let him in his bed. And if you see, Cupcake has a bell because she's belled because she likes to attack the dog. Okay, back to the topic at hand. So the Gilded Age of open source. I'm gonna put a stake in the ground just for the purposes of this talk. I may revisit this sometime because I will probably write about this more over the years. I would say approximately the year 2000 to 2020. Free and open source software started pretty well. Free and open source. Free software started well before that, of course. And it started pretty well. It was communities of people working together to solve problems and scratch their own itches and things like that. And it was largely volunteers, or it was people who were paid to do one thing and deployed open source to do it. And so either covertly or openly got leave from their employers to do the work. People who worked on things like Apache and Linux, of course, and other open source software, GNU tools, and things like that. All right. So that started to slowly turn into a commercial interest. And that helped, and is inextricable from, in my opinion, the growth of the internet. You could not have grown the internet the way that the internet grew without open source, without Linux, without things like that. And of course, open source could not exist without the internet, really. I mean, it's one thing to mail out floppies. Back in 1999, my first job in the industry was with Linux Mall. How many folks remember Linux Mall? A lot fewer hands than I was hoping. How many were alive in 1999? Okay, that's more reassuring. All right. It's one thing to mail somebody a CD or a floppy with Linux on it. It's another thing if, like, Linus had to, like, mail back and forth floppies of his work. Would have progressed a lot more slowly. That gave rise to open source, the term open source, to distinguish it from free software and sanitize it for business and not scare the capitalists. Basically, they didn't like the concept of free software. So it was sanitized, and basically if you look at the open source definition, which comes from Debian's free software guidelines, I think that Richard mentioned this yesterday, if you look at it, they're not dissimilar. I mean, they're really pretty much the same ideas, they're just dressed differently. The four freedoms are well represented within the open source definition itself. So that started taking off with business people who saw opportunities. And then it was really jump-started when Netscape said, we're going to release the source to Mozilla. Now, this may be hard to remember or to think about now, but remember the browser wars when they actually still tried to charge you for browsers. Like they actually, you don't, no one actually paid for it.
I remember building Netscape Mozilla browser, but I don't remember that part.
Oh yeah, Netscape Gold, they were always trying to hit you up for some money. So anyway, so that really started propelling open source more widely into the public consciousness. And then there's this guy. And Linux started putting open source and being the poster child or penguin for open source, which led to some major gains, some major commercial opportunities. Red Hat was like the 8th largest IPO in history at that point. And then we had VA Linux. Anybody remember VA Linux? The company that changed names like 5 times. And yeah, so that was the highest IPO ever. I had a friend who actually had some shares from VA Linux, and just a couple, just because he had his name and a commit on the Linux kernel. And he kept checking with his stockbroker, you know, on the phone, as he used to have to do. And he made $40,000 in about 5 minutes that morning, and he was just white as a sheet, because here was a guy who was barely in his 20s who just made in 1999 $40K. Did not know what to do with that. So as so often happens, that bubble burst in March 2020, and that continued deflating through 2021. But it left behind a lot of infrastructure, and it left behind a lot of things that were created during that time, and e-commerce was here to stay. It shook out a lot of people, or a lot of businesses, but it also had risen a couple that were going to stay around.
I don't think it was 2020. It should be 2000.
Oh, you're correct. I knew somewhere, I thought it was going to be in the 1800s. I knew somewhere in here I was going to mess up a date, but I really thought it was going to be the 1800s. Thank you.
It's just the next bubble.
Yeah, it's, well, did we have a crash in 2020? I don't honestly remember. I was a little preoccupied with this whole plague and some personal stuff, so. Okay, how am I doing on time, by the way? Oh, not terrible. Okay. All right. And so then we had the LAMP stack, which propelled the internet to even greater heights. And, you know, if you look around today, still more than, depending on who's counting and what they're counting, WordPress accounts for north of 40 or even 60% of the domains on the internet right now. Free and open source software still powers the internet. And if it weren't for LAMP, that wouldn't be the case. I mean, the first .com was still heavy with proprietary Unix and you know, boutique hardware from Sun and others. And some people in this room may have cleaned up and picked up some of that hardware when it went on fire sale prices in 2000. But commodity hardware, open source, and Linux really helped the internet grow. And I remember at the time, you know, this saying of, and this started happening, so businesses who were heavily invested in proprietary software started to really take notice and not like it very much. And so, you know, we went around with this Gandhi quote, right? Of first they ignore you, which is the experience a lot of us had early on in the 90s and the 2000s of basically like, I'd like to run Linux in this shop. What? No, get out of here with that. Then they laugh at you, you know, Microsoft would just mock Linux and so on. And then all of a sudden they start to fight you. suddenly you find out that the powers that be are trying to figure out ways to take care of, as Steve Ballmer said, the cancer. And so Microsoft and others backdoor funded SCO's lawsuit to try to, so I don't think anyone who ever walked past a law school thought SCO actually had a case, but they found enough people to say that it did, that it instilled fear and uncertainty and doubt, if everybody remembers that, and kind of slowed the adoption a little bit and made people worry. But that didn't last forever because developers loved open source and they insisted on using open source. And so they brought open source to work and they said, we're going to deploy this app written in open source. And by the way, we'll do it faster. We'll do it more securely. And we'll enjoy doing it more. And by the way, you don't have to pay licensing fees for any of this. And so they, developers really led the way with open source there. Unfortunately, they didn't practice what they preached a lot of the time. This is the Dead Kennedys, for those of you who are familiar. They had an album that was a collection of B-sides and unreleased things called Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. And I've always liked that title because it really explains a lot of the culture, which is basically, if I have to choose between my rights and my freedoms or convenience, I'm probably just going to go with the convenience, So we see adoption of, while these folks are working on open source and deploying open source, leaning towards proprietary tools over and over again. Open source projects can't seem to stop using proprietary tools. Today, you look around and a lot of things are siloed in Slack or Discord or Matrix or somewhere like that. Now, Matrix is open source. It's hard as hell to get information out of, though. It's just completely unusable. And people do their work in GitHub and GitLab and Jira and Google Docs and so on and so forth. And basically, anytime one of these companies changes the rules a little bit, open source projects have to figure out how to adapt to it. And so many Macs, and I know there are a lot in this room, but it always not so much anymore because I've probably gotten numb to it, but boy, I tell you what, in the mid-2000s, it used to really chafe me to see so many Macs at Linux and open source conferences at OSCON and so on. Excuse me. And I'm a big believer in the Apache idea of if it didn't happen on a mailing list, it didn't happen. Basically, for two reasons. One is, in any open source community, things should be discussed in an asynchronous manner, in my opinion, and in a way that allows people to all weigh in and records that decision and that idea. It's not very, if you participated in open source projects that don't have this philosophy, what you find is that they will often revisit decisions over and over and over again. Not because, sometimes this is true, not because somebody is trying to revisit the decision on purpose, but because everybody forgets what was decided and nobody can point back to that decision. And also, email is the great leveler. I know that a lot of people these days don't like it, but everybody can receive and send email, and other tools are a lot harder to get information in and out of. Speaking of things hard to get information in and out of, you have software forges. The first one started up, and this is where open source developers started giving up control of their own infrastructure, for good reasons, by the way, I might add. It's hard to run your own mailing lists and your own repositories and everything, so I don't want to downplay that, because I've worked at enough companies where you have to decide when you're starting up a project, like, where do we put our infrastructure? So first you had SourceForge, which apparently still exists, and there are still a few open source projects that do releases there, and when I see them like land in the LWN inbox, I'm just like, what? Really? Like, seriously? And then there was Launchpad, which was Canonical's attempt to centralize development around Ubuntu. And then there was GitHub, which originally started out as a VC-funded company and then eventually bought by Microsoft. And now basically Microsoft is shoving AI down everyone's throat on it. I don't use GitHub a ton, but I do run, I don't know how many folks have heard of the Linux distribution Bazite, which is basically a Fedora offshoot. And you can easily customize the image for Bazite on GitHub. They have the set of tools to just, like put in the packages you want or whatever you want to do. And I did that, and it wasn't 30 seconds before I got a GitHub PR from Copilot or whatever that I didn't ask for or need. It's like, this is just my tiny little project. I didn't invite you. The forges give companies levers of control, like Richard was talking about, over open source. And it also, in Microsoft's case, lets it basically prowl everybody's source repositories to feed the AI data models. And what's interesting to me that I haven't seen brought up is that you agree to a terms of service when you sign up for GitHub. So theoretically, if you write code and put it on GitHub, you have the ability to give Microsoft that permission. But GitHub, being a GitHub, has a lot of source that was never given to Microsoft by the person who holds the copyright. It was by somebody else, and somebody else created a repo with somebody else's code. And I don't really know how that works in terms of giving them the right to crawl it. I also wanted to throw this in here. In the early days of open source, Apple used to, if folks remember, used to come out and really brag about the open source heritage of Mac OS X, and used to really brag about all the open source stuff they did, and they used to really push Darwin. And that has largely gone away. In fact, Apple has made Mac OS X, which again, a lot of folks who do open source use, harder and harder to do general purpose computing on. I have run a Mac. I don't currently, my wife does. And I hear nothing but complaints lately from people on that about what is the security attestation you have to do now to run an app on Macs? Sorry? Notarization, but isn't there another name for it? Gatekeeper, that's what I was looking for, yes. Give that man a prize. That stuff is, I understand some of the reasons behind it, and I don't think Apple's intentions are 100% bad, but it also is really hostile to general purpose computing, whether they intend it to be or not. I don't know how many folks have seen this quote from Douglas Adams, but it's basically, the thing that amazes me about people continuing to adopt things like Slack is that you keep seeing this pattern over and over again in open source of proprietary tools being yanked away from open source communities, and yet you still see people adopting them. People have made these mistakes over and over again. It would be great if we as a community learn from them. Speaking of mistakes, another thing that happened to me, that happened in my view during the Gilded Age of open source is the rise of single vendor open source. So the early stuff, the LAMP stack, that was all community driven, except with the exception of MySQL, but you also had Postgres. All that other stuff was purely community driven, okay? Apache, HTTPD, Linux, PHP, Perl, and Python, those were all community projects. They were not created by a single vendor to make a profit, but as open source matured, the big things that came out always seemed to come out from major vendors with VC funding that were looking to capitalize on them. And it's pretty obvious now, in retrospect, I think during the time somebody might pipe up and say, is it a good idea to adopt this tool and base our infrastructure on something that VCs have funded and they would get shouted down for being too negative and everything. And then we've seen over and over again that well, maybe they had something there. Companies that were usually using open source just for the marketing value. This is open source. Do you take pull requests? Well, no. Okay, so will you fix this bug that I found? Well, put it in the queue. Are you a paying customer? Well, hey, we'd like to implement this feature because everybody wants this feature. Well, that's in the paid version. I didn't actually touch on open core, which I should add to this at some point. And then there's the rise of the public cloud, which again would not have been possible without open source, but didn't really contribute a lot back to it. So you saw Amazon, for example, coming out with AWS and basically using the heck out of open source, but not really needing to respect the licenses because it was a SaaS product. It was basically something that they didn't distribute, you just rented it from them. Linux and Zen were a major part of the AWS cloud in the beginning. I believe they use KVM now, or maybe even their own in-house stuff. But minimum support. Now, I have friends who work at Amazon. If you're watching, hello. I have friends that work at Amazon, and I know they have beefed up their open source support, and they do some good stuff around open source, and I don't want to disregard that. But I think it would be very hard to argue that Amazon or any of the companies that have based on open source of that size have really contributed back to the extent that they have gotten from open source, or even a major fraction. But the public cloud was considered a threat to FOSS, but not really. It was mostly a threat to the single vendor open source stuff, which led to rug pulls and source available licenses. So you had these companies who had VCs wanting returns, seeing Amazon eat their lunch because Amazon can run MongoDB better than MongoDB folks can because they have the in-house experience to run things at scale that MongoDB can't afford. Same thing with HashiCorp and with Redis and Puppet. They all see bigger companies come along and eating their lunch, and so they start doing these rug pulls. I sat in a talk yesterday about OpenVox, talking about the stuff that has been done since Puppet was eaten by private equity. And again, these things keep happening over and over where a company just decides we're done and we're pulling this back in-house. Sometimes the backlash is big enough, like Redis, that they actually say, you know what, we're sorry. But largely they stick with it. And I put in here, arguably CentOS was a rug pull. I would argue it a little bit because it's different in that Red Hat never really said, you can count on this to run your business. But everybody wanted to count on it to run their business. But Red Hat was pretty emphatic, and I used to work for Red Hat. Red Hat was pretty emphatic about, really, this is for development purposes. This is not for you to run your business on. This is for hobbyists and developers. Yeah, but we're going to run our business on it. Bad idea. And speaking of Red Hat, so first they laugh at you. There's nothing counterculture or whatever that capitalism can't co-opt and make a product out of and buy. There's just nothing. As a child of the 80s who's seen I did a talk at Ohio Linux Fest a few years ago, and as I was driving there, I've forgotten now what I was listening to. I was listening to some punk album's 30th anniversary deluxe reissue. And I'm like, punk albums should not have a deluxe reissue. That is so not punk. But there's nothing that can't be commoditized or bought. And so I think Red Hat being bought by IBM, and I was there when it happened. I was actually waiting. I had just gotten my 5-year puck. When you're at Red Hat for 5-10 years, you get a little puck or something to commemorate it. And I'd just gotten my 5-year puck finally, and I was decorating my office, and it was a Sunday afternoon. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to do, the next 5 years in this room, and my office is so cool. And I get a text from the Wall Street Journal, a friend of mine that I used to work with at Linux Magazine. He says, are the rumors true? What rumors? IBM's buying Red Hat. What? And so, yeah, that was an unpleasant day. All right, speaking of unpleasant days, let's move on to Log4Shell, at which I had the unpleasant experience of also being in the middle of, because I was at the time when this happened serving as the VP of Marketing and Publicity for the ASF. And this was, everyone was saying, now I think in retrospect, was Log4Shell really as bad as everyone was saying it would be? I know that everybody moved heaven and earth to upgrade, but yes? Okay, all right. Okay. I felt it was a little overblown, but we could agree to disagree. But I can tell you, but being in the maelstrom of the attention focused on the ASF at the time was pretty intense. And I was just the person fielding press stuff and everything. I wasn't having to do the patches or any of that stuff. There are people at the ASF, unpaid, unsung heroes who spent, I knew somebody who had COVID and worked more than 24 hours straight to get stuff out the door for Log4Shell, for Log4j. But that really brought a lot of attention to the supply chain, which made things very, very uncomfortable for the people who do open source and don't get paid for it, which led to some conversations that really started to show the cracks in open source. People saying, look, remember, I'm not a supplier. I'm just this person. I did not put the obligatory XKCD cartoon in here because you've all seen it. You can just close your eyes and picture it at this point. I'm just some person in Nebraska or whatever, maintaining one little hobby project that just happens to prop up the internet. The Log4Shell folks, if I remember Log4j, sorry, the Log4j folks, none of them were paid full time to work on Log4j when that happened. It was not their fault that the world decided to make it a dependency for everything. And so that was one of the major cracks for open source. And you had the Cyber Resilience Act. Now the final text of this, I think, turned out okay, but during the process of writing it, there were some really scary drafts. Not that they were very public about the drafts, but there were some scary drafts that circulated that would have made maintainers, individual maintainers, responsible for stuff. It's like, why would I maintain open source if all I'm getting from that is risk? If somebody's going to pick it up and put it in a product and sue me, or consumers can sue me because there's a security hole, that's not a good thing. The beginning of the end to me for the Gilded Age of open source was COVID, though, because the work from home stuff scared the living hell out of the C-suite. I'm not lying. I was at Red Hat at the time, and I can tell you, and Red Hat was a very remote friendly company. As a matter of fact, when I was at Red Hat and living in Raleigh, I was near the headquarters, and they didn't have room for everybody. They were having to expand. And then all of a sudden the focus switches from, we want butts and seats where we can see you, which made no sense for Red Hat because, I worked with people in Europe and Massachusetts and wherever else. It's like, so you want me to drive and sit in a cubicle for video calls? Help make that make sense. But it started a major backlash over salary by activist investors. You had the guy, this activist investor for Google, for example, who was complaining about $300,000 salaries. A man worth, almost $8 billion was complaining about people making $300K. By the way, people who live in California, Mountain View, who make $300K, that's like $50,000 a year in Mountain View. Not really, but $300,000 is not a lot of money. It's a lot of money, but it's not as much money there as it would be, where I lived at the time, which was Raleigh, North Carolina, or before that, St. Louis. If I made $300,000 a year in St. Louis, I'd be living large, you know. And speaking of Google, we have Android. So Android for a long time was seen by open source folks as the, you know, you can trust Google and you can always root your device and run a distribution of Android if you don't want to run a Googled version of Android. But lately, Google is making it look like that may not be possible for much longer. They are pulling back on the ability to, they like to call it sideload applications through F-Droid and others. Most of us just call that installing software, okay? But they invented a term for it because it erodes their walled garden. So I'm wondering how long before Google entirely pulls back from open source releases of Android, except for the parts that they have to, like the Linux kernel. And then we had this. The XZ backdoor was really a strike at the heart of open source because it attacked several weak points at once. It attacked our trust in one another as collaborators. It attacked the weak point in the supply chain of the intersection between where a upstream comes into Linux distributions and is weaved into the distribution, packaged and put into the distribution. And it takes advantage of maintainer burnout that we saw, like with the log for shell stuff. It takes advantage of the fact that most maintainers are overworked. And if state actors or criminal enterprises want to find a weak spot in open source, all they have to do is look for the overworked maintainers. And by the way, that's not hard to find, right? And then you had this that happened last year, which is basically several Russian nationals were removed from the Linux kernel as maintainers because of sanctions, because the Linux Foundation said so. And I'm not going to get into whether I think that's right or wrong, because I think the Linux Foundation has to comply with the laws of the country that they're in, and they are not an organization that is well placed to say, nope, this is the hill we're going to die on. Do I think that the Russian individuals who were removed needed to be? I have absolutely no reason to think that they needed to be. But I'm not going to get into that because I don't know enough about it. But it is a clear example of geopolitics intruding on open source in a way that's probably going to get worse and not better in the interim. And there's also, as with Android, just a general attack on general purpose computing. And it's sort of like free speech. How many people have kids that just really don't even want to use a computer, like a proper computer, or care about general computing? My daughter does everything, and I do mean literally everything, on her phone. I've watched this kid write papers on a phone, and it makes me insane. But she just, despite the fact that, you know, what I do for a living, she could not care less about general purpose computing. And it's kind of falling out of favor. Tech companies are hostile to it, and users don't seem to care. And then, of course, there is the rise of AI that is, in a lot of ways, harming open source, not least of which is open source is now not the new kid in town and the interesting one anymore. Open source is now, like, VCs aren't looking to invest in open source anymore. It's not exciting. They want to invest in AI. Developers are no longer the kingmaker. They're trying to get rid of you. You know, and whether you want it or not, it's coming. They're slipping it into Firefox. They're slipping it into Fedora. Red Hat has a mandate for people. Your bonuses are partially tied, apparently, to using AI. This is a screenshot of a picture of my boss. Now, technically, LWN isn't an open source project, but we have been besieged by AI bot scrapers for the last more than a year now, and it does occasionally just throws everything into chaos because we have to fight off the scrapers. And then this, I'll put these slides up later, but this is a recent complaint from somebody in Azure complaining about AI PRs and people who are submitting things generated by AI of such length that they can't possibly review them. And then, if you go through this comment thread, there are people arguing like, well, you shouldn't review them anymore. That's not what humans are for anymore. And there are the inevitabilists, but I am not one. I do believe that we can, in fact, push back on AI. And maybe we can't put it all the way back in the box, but we can put it in the corner, and we can use it where it's appropriate and not all of the time. So I have an honest question for the audience that probably won't have time for Q&A, but think about this, is do you care? Do you care about open source? And it's an honest question, because I wonder sometimes, a lot of people have used open source because it's pragmatic, it's convenient, but it may just be that open source was a temporary thing, or that it'll fade into a small thing, kind of like ham radio or something, where there's nothing wrong with ham radio. I don't have a ham radio. But what I mean by that is there's a small dedicated community that keeps ham radio alive, and there will always, I think, be a small dedicated community around open source. But it may fade from the mainstream, and I think that would be sad. In '99, I thought open source would change the world, and it did. But the world also changed open source, and not for the better. But I don't think it's too late. I think we can push back, and we can, do better. And what that looks like is redefining open source to not be just about licenses. We need to mentor. One of the things that I think we went really wrong is that we did not do a good job of mentoring people into open source. Once open source became kind of mainstream, we just said we won and walked away. And so the next generation coming up didn't really have the same values and didn't understand why certain things were important, and why would they, because nobody really emphasized it. Right now we have, I think, a really good moment to reemphasize open source. Right now we are seeing so many things. People hate Windows 11. People don't trust the US right now, tech companies, for good reason. And that's an opportunity. The EU is doing a call for comments about open source, and a lot of the ideas that I see are around pay maintainers, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but I would insist on, again, when the ASF faced Log4Shell, one of the things that maintainers kept saying is, don't just throw money at the ASF, get involved. Like, don't just throw money, look at the code, get involved. Don't just be a bystander. It's not a spectator sport. So I believe a progressive era for open source is possible. Things aren't great right now, but they can be turned around, and if it does, it starts with y'all. And so I'll leave you with the Lorax. Is Dr. Seuss a thing in Europe, or is that like not? It is, okay, good. I would be curious to read Dr. Seuss like translated into German, and how they make it rhyme, but all right. This is me. I'd like to thank everybody. I probably went a little bit over. You can contact me at any of these, and thanks a lot for listening to me babble. I can.
If there are a few questions, quickly. One there.
Yeah. I'm sorry? Oh, there's a light there.
Trump is a big help to all of us in the EU, because he's highlighting digital sovereignty and the fact that we shouldn't trust things that are owned by others. So
we took one for the team there. It was a big one. I almost had a picture of a headline with Trump actually in the slides, and then I realized, like, I don't want to inflict that on anybody. Y'all see him enough. Any other questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
A little bit of follow-up of a comment made by the gentleman over here. Since the geopolitical situation for you in the US is choosing how you imply the Second Amendment, do you see the
First Amendment.
First and second. that depend on that. Anyways, do you see the ASF moving, immigrating to some place more friendly?
The question was, do I see the ASF moving somewhere more friendly? And the answer to that is, I'm not as involved in the ASF these days, in no small part because I'm now doing news, and if I ever have to write about them, it would be awkward. But I haven't heard anyone talking about that seriously. I was on a panel at FOSDEM. I think the smartest thing for people to do, if you have a US nonprofit or entity, the smart thing would probably be to spin up a sister organization in Europe or wherever else makes sense. It's unfortunate that you can't have a stateless nonprofit for open source or something, but we need like a Cayman Islands for open source. But yeah, that would Switzerland possibly, yeah. So thank you. Did that answer your question?
Sort of, yes.
Okay, all right, we'll go with sort of. Yes, sir.
We just were talking about the ASF. I kind of have felt even though they're a 501c3,
Yeah.
it seems like they kind of act in the interest of corporations more than individuals. Do you not see it as that way?
So not really, but I think the main, the question was, do I see the ASF acting more in the interest of corporations and individuals? I would say not exactly, but I see how you could come to that conclusion, because a lot of people involved in the ASF, some folks in the ASF like to point out that everyone is volunteers, which is technically true, but what's obvious is that a lot of people work on ASF projects as part of their day job, and what happens is that when someone exits their day job, they usually or often exit the community unless they happen to keep working on the same project at their next day job. But to counter that, there are also examples of resilience. I worked on Apache Cloud Stack back in the day, which Citrix completely pulled out of by the mid-2010s. But that project is still going because because the Apache way ensured that project would have enough contributors outside of Citrix to sustain itself. Now, there aren't really a lot of interesting projects in the ASF for individuals either. You have things like Kafka that, how many people are running Kafka in your basement? Not many, some of you probably, but not a lot. I know there's one of you, man. There's like one person at least. Same as Kubernetes. Like there are a couple of you who are probably like running full-blown Kubernetes in your basement, but or wherever. Maybe you don't have a basement. Did that answer your question?
Well, we have a 10 minutes break.
Okay.
And then we have a panel, so we need to set up the panel. If you're on the panel, please come to the panel. But yeah, we have 10 minutes to set up everything. You can go and get a coffee.
All right.